Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. Robert Shrum is a world-famous political strategist and an outstanding speechwriter who has just moved to New York to teach and write. But he's also been an old friend of mine. So we've known each other now for 34 years.
35,
36
right.
years. I knew you when you really had your first speechwriting job.
That's right, with John Lindsay.
Right.
And you had this wonderful office, and whenever I'd get depressed or it was late and had to get some food, I'd go hide down there and we'd order some food. Yeah.
Right. Do you remember that? I don't know if you remember this, but there used to be bathroom glass in the window so people wouldn't be able to look in, and I hated that. So when I had them change the thing, they couldn't believe that people would be able to look in your office and it would be all right. But that's when government was really open.
Oh, City Hall was totally open. I had that little office off the press office that I shared with the teletype,
I
the
later
old
had
teletype
that office.
machines. And when there was the riot at the time at Kent State, when the mayor had declared a day of mourning for the young lady who had been shot at Kent State, the rioters came straight up the street, came right into City Hall Plaza. We had, what, 2 or 3 cops. There weren't any more than that. The mayor wasn't there. And people started throwing bricks through windows.
They went in and raised the flag.
Matty Troy went up on it, who was the city councilman from Queens, who ironically went up, raised the flag, you know, proclaimed that we stood with our troops, and soon after was very involved in the McGovern campaign.
So I remember that too. So what's happened to the passion that we saw in those days?
You know, I think it's there. I think it's there in a different way. I think we saw it on the internet last year. I think we have, instead of having movements just in the streets, although we're beginning to see those again, we're having a virtual movement. I mean, the notion that first Howard Dean raised the amount of money he did on the internet, and then that John Kerry raised $220 million on the internet, and the DNC raised that kind of money on the internet. I think those are people who, for the most part, had never contributed to campaigns before, who thought they could make a difference and who wanted their voice heard. I hope they don't get discouraged because they almost won. But
Howard Dean's people, they may have contributed, but they didn't vote, right? Is that what happened? We don't know what happened.
Oh, I think I know what happened. I mean, because I was, you know, I was Senator Kerry's strategist, and I had always believed that on January 1st, when we went into Iowa, people would say, now I'm going to get serious about who I actually think could or should be president. And at that point, I think Dean, partly because he lacked national security experience, but partly because of some of the things he had said, voters drew back from. And
was it the war?
Well, the war was what made him a strong candidate in the first place.
But was it also the thing that scared people?
No, because I think every Democrat by the time of Iowa, to one degree or another, with the exception of Joe Lieberman, who wasn't there, he was off in New Hampshire, was indicating profound dissatisfaction, at least with the aftermath of the war.
What was the famous question that John Kerry was asked? Would he reconsider it with what he knew now or something? And he said no, or he gave a long, convoluted answer that we didn't quite understand.
He was asked at the
later in the
train trip after the convention. He was asked a question at the Grand Canyon that I thought was extruded, hypothetical, and difficult to follow. And I think what he was saying was that he still would have voted for the resolution, but he would not have gone to war at the time Bush did, in the way Bush did, or perhaps maybe at all. Now, American politics is hostile to nuance. And I'm not, you know, you got to function in the system you're in. And so he had to go back before the first debate, come here, went to New York University, gave a speech, and said very clearly, knowing what I know today, of course I wouldn't go to war in Iraq. But his argument was, and you know, people can deride it or not, his argument was that the intelligence agencies were saying there were weapons of mass destruction, that he therefore was going to vote to give the president the authority, that he assumed it would only be used in the case of weapons of mass destruction, that the inspectors would be given time and that diplomacy would be given time. That was his public position on the issue.
It's a very difficult thing when you say that it's hard to get nuance, because there's a very instinctive thing about politics, isn't there?
Yeah, and also, you know, and when you look back on it,
you like somebody or you don't.
Yeah, And look, I mean, everybody except Bush, who has no nuance at all, and actually we could use some from him.
Right.
People have gotten in trouble before on this kind of thing, although they've extricated themselves. I mean, you know, Kennedy in 1960 said at the time of the U-2 crisis that while he wouldn't have apologized to Khrushchev, he would have expressed regrets. And Nixon kept banging away on that through the entire...
It didn't matter with him because people liked him.
See, I don't think like... I don't
you
think
don't think so.
Look,
I read someplace that you were always interested in politics when you were a kid, right? In school politics and all of that. And at one point you met Jack Kennedy.
That's true.
And you were really wowed by that.
Yeah, I was. Yeah. I mean, he was an extraordinary person, and I think it wasn't just, you didn't have to meet him in a way, because a whole generation met him, and a whole generation got...
I never met him, but I felt that I knew him. But I grew up with Roosevelt, who was a giant in my family, who loved Roosevelt, so he was always somebody I could look up to. And then the next step was basically a John Kennedy and then a Robert Kennedy, and then we had a little bit of John Lindsay. And after that, it's been nobody. Who inspires you now?
Oh, I mean,
are there any inspiring people?
Oh, I think there
are. Or they're thoughtful and good people, but do you think that they really capture an imagination?
I think, for example, that all the people who haven't been president in the last 50 or 60 or 70 years, Edward Kennedy has probably done more to change this country and make it better. And I always marvel at him because he's been attacked so much. You know,
he's the only person that I think that I relate to and that I feel has the kind of passion that I'm talking about and doesn't have to consider the ramifications of everything he says.
Well, I think people ought to stop thinking too much about what their pollsters say.
Right.
I mean, I remember, well, there have been times when I've seen people say, I don't care what the polls say. I'm gonna. Right. I mean, in the 1994 Senate re-election campaign in Massachusetts, it was a tough election for Kennedy. It was the only really tough one he's had since 1962. Mitt Romney was running against him, and he actually was behind by a point or two. And there was going to be a vote in the Senate on welfare, so-called welfare reform, that would have been a pretty draconian cut based on on circumstances that applied to a lot of different women. And so we get in this conversation about how's he going to vote on this, and he basically said, you guys can have whatever conversation you want, but if you think I'm taking food away from a hungry child to get myself reelected to the United States Senate, you're crazy.
And that's really what a political leader should be, right? And isn't that what makes inspiration? Well, who else is there? Well, I know you don't want to...
No, listen, I'm not going to get down and critique everybody, but I think we always have to be careful about this because there is a phenomenon, the they were giants, there were giants in those days phenomenon. I mean, I remember when I first got to Washington in the early 1970s, and people would say, well, in the 50s there were giants, you know. Well, who was there then? Humphrey, McGovern, I mean, Teddy, a truly extraordinary group of people. And then, 10 years later, people say, well, there were giants then. Politics is very unforgiving. I mean, you look at, you look first at John Kerry, who, if, as I've put it before, if half a football field worth of voters in Ohio had voted differently, he'd be president. And people would be explaining why Bush lost because the country didn't think he had enough nuance, wasn't sophisticated enough. Or, Al Gore, who I think did win in the year 2000, and who, if the votes had been counted in Florida, would probably be in his second term as president.
And Kennedy didn't win by that much, but they didn't really, I don't think either one of the candidates, Kerry or Gore, captured the hearts of people. I think it was a more intellectual vote.
Well, they're both people for whom I have immense respect and who I like personally very much. But I remember, and you'll remember it too, that Eric Sevareid did a commentary in the middle of the 1960 campaign where he basically said, look, Kennedy or Nixon, it doesn't make any difference. They're both these cool organizational guys. They don't really appeal to anything deep in people. And Arthur Schlesinger had to write a little book, a little instant book called Kennedy or Nixon, Does It Make Any Difference? Or Franklin Roosevelt, your hero you mentioned a while ago. I mean, Walter Lippmann in 1932 wrote a column saying, this guy's a lightweight, he's not going to change anything, he doesn't really have any passion, doesn't really have any hold on people. So I think you have to be careful of that. It is sort of sad that some of these folks, you know, if given the chance to serve as president, the country clearly would relate to them in a different way. I think Al Gore, for example, has a skill set that under the circumstances of 2001, had he won the 2000 election, he would have been very tough, and we would have been after the Taliban in Afghanistan, but we sure wouldn't have invaded Iraq on the basis of dubious intelligence. We would have kept focused on Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. And I think people would have responded to that.
Since 1960, the mechanics of campaigning have changed. I mean, we've gotten political strategists more and more, and it's. I remember going back to Barnard, where I went to college, and this young woman came up to me and she said, I want to become a campaign manager, or I want to be a political consultant. Right. And I thought to myself, I've never heard that before. I never heard that as a profession, but it has become a large industry, electioneering. Yeah. But it's removed from people.
For me it was, you know, as you know, for me it was an accident.
And with you, it was a total evolution.
I always wanted to be involved in politics and public service, and I got involved as a speechwriter, and it just, things moved along. I mean, but the original group of people who were political consultants, David Garth, Bob Squire, David Sawyer, all came out of television or advertising backgrounds. But there's no reason not to expect that over time, if someone does this a lot and people think they're good, that they're not going to be asked to do it repeatedly, and that it's not somehow or they're going to professionalize. But
it's also changed. I mean, in 1960 it was the big debate. It wasn't necessarily all the ads that the candidates had on television.
Although there was one devastating ad from Kennedy in 1960 that I think Bill Wilson made, but it was, you know, Eisenhower had been asked at a press conference, Vice President Nixon's running on the basis of his experience. You've worked with him for 8 years. Can you think of
and he couldn't think of anything.
Of any major policy that he's been responsible for? It was worse. He said, if you give me a week, I might think of something.
It became a Kennedy.
It was the first negative ad classic negative ad, but it wasn't mean, didn't alienate people, and it hurt Nixon very badly.
Have the political operations now replaced the party's roles, do you think? And do you think part of our problem is that we don't have parties that are clearly distinguishing what they are?
I don't think we've had, well, I do think the parties are very distinct and much more aggregated than they were in 1960 or 1956. I mean, in 1956 or 1960 or even 1965, there were liberal Republicans.
Right.
There was John Lindsay and Jacob Javits. There was a guy named Prescott Bush who I think wouldn't quite recognize his grandson as president, who was a senator from Connecticut.
Who was the senator from Oregon who was such
Mark Hatfield.
And another one who was...
Well, Wayne Morris went from Republican to independent to Democrat.
Right.
And he kind of reflected the fact that the parties were sorting themselves out along ideological lines, which is not necessarily entirely good for the country. Because, you know, let's say somebody wins, manages to sort of, by one vote in the Supreme Court, get elected the first time, and by a very narrow margin get elected the second time, on behalf of a party that is very extreme in its views and then proceeds to implement those policies. I mean, Kennedy came in 1960 and said, look, I didn't win by a lot. You know, I have to get C. Douglas Dillon, who had been an assistant secretary of state, I think, in the Eisenhower administration, made him secretary of the Treasury, you know, and reached out across the political spectrum. Bush hasn't done that. And I think
and nobody does that anymore.
Partly because I think it's the nature of the party. So I don't know. I mean, the parties, the grip of the old parties had to be broken. I mean, in 1932, the party bosses left to their own devices would not have nominated Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, ultimately, it took a deal between William Gibbs McAdoo, who had been the nominee or had been denied the nomination in 1924 in this endless convention that went 124 ballots, and William Randolph Hearst and John Nance Garner, brokered, by the way, by Joseph P. Kennedy, that got Roosevelt the nomination on the 4th or 5th ballot. I mean, in 1960, JFK went out and challenged the party establishment by winning primaries.
Yeah.
In 1968, and this is unthinkable today, Hubert Humphrey got nominated without entering a single primary or caucus. And that, at that point, people said, enough. We're not going to do this again. We're going to trust voters to do this.
I was part of that McGovern Commission or whatever the work was that refined the. But now, I mean, now you have to be really. One has to wonder if these candidates are crazy or not. I mean, the effort it takes and the money it takes and the disruptions to lives.
Well, but I think it took a lot of effort before and a lot of money.
I'm sure it does.
But look, the McGovern Commission was criticized, especially after Senator McGovern, who is a very close friend of mine, someone I deeply admire, lost so badly in 1972. But the truth is that I think you could argue that the fact that voters actually get to pick the nominees in both parties has, on balance, worked pretty well over the last 30 or 40 years.
Except they're voters that in Iowa and New Hampshire, and that, but I mean, they do give them momentum.
They do a pretty good job of sorting out the process. You just talked about expense. If you started, let's say, in Michigan, which people talk about, and my friend Debbie Dingell will get mad if she sees this, but fortunately she doesn't live in New York City. John Dingell, the congressman from Michigan's wife. If you started in Michigan, the cost of the process would go up astronomically because the cost of the television advertising would go up astronomically.
That's so interesting. So how much gets dictated by what and everything else. So you're teaching now. What are you teaching?
I'm teaching a freshman honors seminar this semester called Do Words Have Power? Speeches and Debates in National Politics from 1960 to 2004. And next semester I'm going to teach a graduate course to public policy students in the relationship between public policy making and politics. Because as you know from your experience in City Hall, very often someone can come up with a really great idea and it's supported by all the data, and you take it into the principal or the elected official and they say, can't do that in a million years.
So does it really get that high a level? I mean, let's talk about that a little bit, because it's so interesting. I mean, people go to graduate school and they come out and they're scholars or they're professors, but they're really running on a parallel level with reality. Sometimes.
Well, but see, I think Ellen Shaw, who's the dean of the Wagner School and who worked in city government for a long time, fabulous person. You know, Mitchell Moss, Paul Light, some of the other people I met there are really committed to the idea that they can turn out scholars, that they can turn out people who are academically rigorous, disciplined, really know what they're doing, but also really understand the real world. And that's what I think makes Wagner a very special place.
And Wagner is the graduate school at NYU.
Graduate School of Public Service, right?
Use this premise now, what's going on now. What are I mean, is there any public policy? Well, there is public policy. There's private policy in the federal government.
But if you look at Bush, I mean, you know, it would have been better if FEMA had been run, you know, by the last 10 master's or PhD graduates in public policy from Wagner. I mean, they took the White House advanced staff and dumped them over at FEMA. They took I mean, it's world famous now, a guy who ran the International Arabian Horse Association. And, you know,
and they weren't too pleased with him, I gather.
Well, except Bush stood there in public and said, Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job.
No, I meant the Arabian
Oh, no, the Arabian Horse Association. No, but if you're anti-government, I'm beginning to think you're not very good at running the government.
Well, that's, I think, exactly with the Republicans and Bush. I mean, they want a smaller government.
Right.
And now they have a smaller government that can't accommodate the larger issues, right?
Yeah, well, I think there's a connection between Iraq and Katrina.
Right.
Ideologically, they wanted to downgrade FEMA because they thought the federal government should not be doing this. States and localities should be doing this. Quite often, by the way, that kind of language, I think, is code for we don't have to worry about poor people. We don't have to worry about people in trouble. You know, they can do that closer to the ground if they want. Ideology took them into Iraq, and then in both places they compounded what they did by total incompetence.
But they have the same ideology in Iraq also, with a smaller army, different more efficient weapons. But we're going to be able to pinpoint where we're, you know, isn't that true?
Well, they have it on paper, but then they can't get the armored vehicles there.
Right.
They had no post-war plan. You know, I think it's in 1942, which was not the brightest period for Allied fortunes in World War II, when Roosevelt called people in and said, I want the documents prepared now and the recommendations prepared on the post-war occupation of both Japan and Germany. And basically, when the State Department tried to do even a very truncated version of that, the Defense Department squashed it and Bush didn't care. So the ideology led them in, and then they're incompetent in executing the policy. It is extraordinary to me. But there's going to be an ironic fallout of this. It's under George Bush that we're going to realize that the era of small government is over. People are going to want a government that can respond to a terrorist attack on the homeland.
Are they going to want to pay more taxes?
Oh, I think people.
Yeah.
Look, I think there was in 2004 widespread support among voters, and Kerry never blinked from saying it, to repeal the Bush tax cut for people at the top. I mean, and obviously that ought to be done. I mean, people who are, but they have the opposite philosophy. I think some of what they're going to try to do in the Reconstruction is to promote every right-wing nostrum they can.
Well, they're doing, aren't they doing, they're not doing competitive bidding, they're just giving out contracts in both places the same way, right?
So you got the public schools obviously have all these problems in New Orleans, they're flooded, all these things have happened. So what's their answer? Private school vouchers? I mean, they got to spend the money, go in, fix up the public schools and get kids back into school.
You give a voucher, you have no place to go.
That's right. I mean, you can go into another flooded building, except it can be private. But I think you're going to see a lot of that. I suspect you'll see some suspension of environmental regulations that shouldn't be suspended. I think you'll see incredible kinds of tax incentives that are skewed to people at the top. But fundamentally, there will be a huge investment in Reconstruction, and there ought to be. It ought not to be a cover for right-wing fantasy.
The other interesting thing is that the temperature of the ocean has risen. And we have all these hurricanes this year, and some people have said that, it's all different. If the temperature of the ocean is this not a sign of global warming that the president doesn't think is happening? Is that too cheap, or is that too superficial?
Well, neither Bush nor I are scientists. The difference
certainly am I.
But the difference between us is that I'm willing to listen
to the
scientists who say that we have a serious problem with global warming, we have a serious problem with the rise in sea levels, and that we have to do something about CO2 emissions and the other kinds of emissions that are creating a greenhouse effect.
And he says,
well, because it would make some of his very powerful special interest contributors unhappy. He just denies the science.
Don't we have this innate denial? Don't we want to think that public officials know what they're doing? I mean, in society, we like to think that people with authority really know what they're doing.
Yes, and that's why I believe Bush got reelected for only one reason. It was a 9/11 election. They thought that he responded to 9/11.
When he stood on that.
And in a way, that was the question in their minds on Election Day. Kerry passed the threshold. They said he can handle national security, but they said, and the Osama bin Laden tape came out on Friday, and I think people said, by a very narrow margin, we're going to just stay with Bush. Now I think Bush stands revealed as someone who doesn't know what he's doing.
Right.
And I think it's not just in the hurricane, as I said, it's in Iraq.
So this is, it's a step of revelations. One is that I think a lot of people don't know what they're doing. If you act as if you know what you're doing, it takes you a long way. You're saying it's not the individual, but it's really the authority that goes along with the position or the way it's been established in the public mind.
Look, I think Roosevelt knew what he was doing. I think Kennedy and Johnson knew what they were doing. They didn't always do the right thing.
Right.
Let me tell you, I do not like Richard Nixon. I mean, he knew what he was doing, and the more we read about Ronald Reagan, the more we find out that he did know what he was doing, because he was not a detail guy. And if you get elected president at 70 and you're going to be a detail guy, you're not going to do a very good job. But he had like 5 big ideas. Those were the things he cared about. And on one of them, never negotiate with the Soviets, he was willing to turn around completely when he met Gorbachev and said, I can work with this guy. I think what we have here is someone who basically is just disconnected from these problems. I mean, how can you go down, look at this damage, and tell a joke about rebuilding Trent Lott's front porch? I mean,
or that this is a place you had too much to drink.
Right. My guess is Lott was. My guess is Lott himself was
embarrassed.
Yes.
It was really horrifying. So what do you think is going to happen? Are we going to have a primary for president in the Democratic Party with how many candidates?
I don't know how many candidates. We will have a primary.
A lot?
Well, we could have a lot or a few. I mean, we will have a primary. We always do. I think obviously Senator Clinton is very interested in running. I think Senator Kerry may run again. I think Senator Edwards, former Senator Edwards, may run. Senator Biden, Governor Vilsack. I mean,
it's a lot. And what about in the Republican Party?
I think John McCain will run. I think that Chuck Hagel, the senator from Nebraska, would like to run. The problem is he appeals to the same constituency as McCain.
And neither of them are to the conservative base that Bush thrives with, are they?
Well, you know,
sometimes they are, and sometimes
the
they're
Republican. But there's an interesting thing about the Republican Party. If you wait your turn in line, you actually they
right?
nominate.
It's more orderly.
They nominate the person they're supposed to nominate. I mean, that's why Bob Dole got nominated.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, if you look at it, if you go back, they always nominate the favorite going in.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Bush in 2000,
it's true. It's
Dole
very
in
interesting.
96, you know,
and the
Bush in 88.
And how often have the Democrats nominated the favorite?
Well, we didn't, you know, I mean, I would argue that in 2004 there was no effective favorite.
Right.
I mean, Kerry actually broke a rule, which was that the person who had the most money on hand at the end of the year had been the nominee for a fairly long string of years. But in 88, I don't think there was a favorite or a front runner. I don't think there was last time.
Right.
Bill Clinton in 92 started out as probably one of the two or three people most likely, probably two, he or Bob Kerry, most likely to win. But we are by nature a more disorderly party. I obviously think that Senator Clinton has enormous advantages if she wants to run going into this. But I also think that it'll be a real contest in the sense that other people will go out there. They will.
Oh, definitely. I think they will. So you've displayed now that you are both a historian, right?
Well, I'm an amateur. I've read a lot of history.
It's very impressive. I want to know. Are you going to stay as a professor 3 years from now, or are you going to go back into politics?
I'm not going back.
Not
I'm going to write about it. I'm going to talk about it because I can't help but talking. It's sort of second nature.
And you're going to help sometimes because you're quite eloquent.
Listen,
so you're going to write a few speeches.
Well,
maybe you'll give some speeches.
I am really going to focus on doing some writing of my own and what I do at NYU, which I think is one of the most exciting universities in the country and has moved very far, very fast.
So we've gone through 30 minutes very quickly. Thank you very much, Bob Shrum, and I'm welcome to New York. I'm delighted you're here, and I'm delighted that you're teaching other people.
Oh, thank you very much. Great to be here, Ronnie.
Is there any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore? Please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.